What's up, everyone? Tara Roberts here with 444, and trade deadlines are right around the corner. Don't end up stuck with players that could struggle at the end of the fantasy season or have volatility that you just can't trust for your fantasy playoff push. So, we are talking players that you need to sell before your trade deadline. Before we get started, remember to like this video and subscribe. And if you want more fantasy insights and tips, head over to 444.com/plans and sign up for a subscription today. And exclusively for our YouTube audience, use promo code YouTube at checkout to save 25%. Now let's go ahead and dive right in with our first player, Brian Robinson. Brian Robinson is coming off an epic 27 fantasy point performance, and this is the perfect time to sell. Robinson is actually a top 10 back in total points, just behind guys like Christian McCaffrey, Travis Etienne, and Alvin Kamara, and that's in PPR, which is pretty impressive considering that we came into the season assuming Robinson would have limited receiving upside, but that's total points. In average points per game, he's averaging 14.2 fantasy points, which isn't bad, but it's nowhere near the upside of top running backs. And the real problem here is that his average is aggressively propped up by extreme outlier performances. Robinson has had 2 overall RB1 weekly finishes of nearly 30 fantasy points. Outside of those 2 games, he's never finished higher than RB15. That is not good. You may be intrigued and wanting to keep Robinson for good upcoming matchups. Next week's matchup is against the Giants, but he already faced the Giants in week 7 and had just 8 fantasy points. Week 12 is a bad matchup against Dallas. Week 13 could be theoretically good against Miami, but if the game gets out of hand, we have zero guarantee that the pass volume will go to Robinson. When it comes down to it, Brian Robinson is an early down back with inconsistent receiving volume in a shared backfield on a team with a terrible defense that has to push heavy pass volume to compete. Sell Brian Robinson. The next player that we want to talk about is coming off a strong performance as well that we could potentially use to pawn him off onto another team. After weeks and weeks of wondering if Geno Smith would be able to pull himself together, we finally got that big game in week 10. 31 completions on 47 attempts for 369 yards and 2 touchdowns. But I'm not actually impressed or sold on this. I am selling Geno Smith. This is the type of production that I expect any competent quarterback to have against Washington's defense. Outside of this game, Geno has had just one other top 10 performance, and that was in a high volume game against Detroit. Without that game and the week 10 performance, Geno's finishes have been between QB 15 and QB 29. And while some of those have been difficult defensive matchups, QB 29 is inexcusable. You cannot finish as QB 29 when there are only 28 teams playing. The math doesn't work that way. Essentially, Geno needs to have the most ideal matchup to give us a QB1 performance, and moving forward, there's not a ton of ideal matchups for him. This week, Geno faces a team that he had just 112 passing yards against in week 1. And then he faces San Francisco, Dallas, and San Francisco again. He gets a break against Philadelphia and Tennessee, and then he faces Pittsburgh. So really, you were benching Geno for 4 straight weeks before you can get to an advantageous situation. Or you could sell him right now and just be done with it. Moving on to our next player. I hate to pick on the Dolphins because I already had Tua as a trade candidate, but the numbers don't lie. Sell Jaylen Waddle before your trade line and make sure that you aren't stuck with what could be a highly disappointing finish to the fantasy season. We all know that Waddle is the wide receiver 2 behind Tyreek Hill, and nothing will change that. But this is less about Tyreek Hill and more about Waddle's stats being so dependent on Tua. If Tua has a bad game from a fantasy perspective, Tyreek Hill can still produce wide receiver 1 numbers. But Waddle doesn't really have that luxury. Tua has had 4 games below 15 fantasy points. In those 4 games, Waddle has had 12.4, 8.6, 12.3, and 8.4 fantasy points in PPR. That is an average around 10 fantasy points. For perspective, guys that are averaging around 10 fantasy points on the season are players like Calvin Ridley, Jaden Reed, Jerry Jeudy, and Tutu Atwell. Now, I know you're thinking, well, Tara, that's on the season as a whole. You take the good with the bad, and that is true. But the problem here is, if you're a strong team head into the playoffs, you might want to look ahead. Weeks 15 through 17, the Dolphins face the Jets, Dallas, and Baltimore. Those are all games where Tua could struggle with production. And that would mean that we are looking at a playoff run with Waddle giving you the bare minimum with limited upside. Here's the good news. This is a trade before your trade deadline. So if your league's trade deadline isn't this week, you have time. This week's matchup is against Vegas. That is an excellent matchup. So you've got a little time before you have to pull the trigger, but you do need to trade him. So figure out who you're targeting and sell Waddle. And our final player that we're going to talk about here is Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel returned in week 10 and had 3 carries for 29 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Plus, he caught all 4 of his targets for 30 yards. The 49ers offense as a whole thrived and demolished the Jags 34-3. And all the 49ers receivers and weapons had very solid games. But that is the crux of the issue. All of the weapons. Christian McCaffrey, Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle alongside Deebo Samuel. It is really tough to have significant touches in an offense that is that stacked. Even in a game where the 49ers had 34 points, Deebo still only had 7 touches. Even if you look at his targets per snap rate, he still falls behind Brandon Ayuk. He simply doesn't have the volume needed to shine in this offense. The floor and ceiling are drastically different for Deebo. Deebo could give you 25 fantasy points in an ideal scenario, or he could literally give you 0 fantasy points. Like, literally 0. He had 0.6 fantasy points in week 4 on a 87% snap count. Deebo is a volatile player in a very crowded offense, and if you can sell him now for good value and transition to a player with more stability, that is the best move for you. That wraps things up for us. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like the video, comment below, and if you want more fantasy insights and tips, head over to 4for4.com/plans and sign up for a subscription today. And exclusively for our YouTube audience, use promo code YouTube at checkout to save 25%.